US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga are holding a meeting on the sidelines of the Quad Summit in Tokyo. Pompeo hailed Japan's new Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga as a force for good and said he believes that Suga will work to strengthen the relationship between Washington and Tokyo.
Prime Minister Suga was a powerful force for good when he served for this relationship too, when he was the Chief Cabinet Secretary. I had a chance to meet him then. And the United States has every reason to believe he will strengthen our enduring alliance in his new role. In his first statement after assuming office, Prime Minister Suga described a free and open Indo-Pacific as, quote, the foundation of regional peace and stability, end of quote. I could not agree more.
Indian External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar also met US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and they held a meeting on the sidelines of the Quad Summit in Tokyo. This was the first face-to-face meeting between Jaishankar and Pompeo amid border tensions between India and China and the coronavirus outbreak that has plagued the world. The talks come as Washington and New Delhi prepare for the third 2+2 dialogue, which is expected to be held later this month. Earlier, Pompeo said that the Quad nations will be making some significant announcements at this summit. The US Secretary of State also met with Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga. Pompeo hailed Suga as a force for good and said that he believes that Suga will work to strengthen the relationship between Washington and Tokyo.
Prime Minister Suga was a powerful force for good when he served for this relationship too, when he was the Chief Cabinet Secretary. I had a chance to meet him then. And the United States has every reason to believe he will strengthen our enduring alliance in his new role. In his first statement after assuming office, Prime Minister Suga described a free and open Indo-Pacific as, quote, the foundation of regional peace and stability, end of quote. I could not agree more.
Joining us on this broadcast is Benoit Chardy-Chartrand. He's a professor of international relations and he's based in Tokyo, and he's an East Asia analyst so at the Temple University in Japan. So I welcome you to the show, and first of all, Professor, tell us what's the main agenda of this Quad meeting and how significant it is coming at a time when for India there have been tensions along the border with China. So is China likely to be one of the main discussion points, of talking points during this Quad meeting?
Absolutely. China will be one of the main issues. It will loom very large on this meeting. They're also officially talking about coordinating COVID responses. So COVID-19, the pandemic, will also be a significant part of the agenda. But there's no doubt that the question of how to respond to Chinese foreign policy and Chinese actions over the last few months is going to be one of the main topics of this meeting. You mentioned already the difficult situation in the relationships between India and China, but we have to keep in mind that all four of the Quad members have had their own difficulties with China over the last few months or the last few years. So Australia and China, the relationship is also has been declining over the last few months. We know obviously that the US-China relationship has hit probably rock bottom and looks likely to continue to decline. I would say only the relation between Japan and China has been relatively stable over the last few months, but as we know, there's always some underlying tensions between these two countries. So of course, yes, this meeting comes at a very significant or important juncture.
Right, you mentioned that all the four countries have had friction with China in recent times, but let's focus on Japan-India relations at the moment as well. How do you see Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga? How much importance does he place on relations or improving relations with India at the moment?
Undoubtedly, Prime Minister Suga, who has only been in power for less than a month now, looks to continue the recent or the foreign policy road or approach that former Prime Minister Abe pursued during his almost 8 years in office. During Abe's tenure in Tokyo as Prime Minister, he really tried and actually succeeded in reinforcing relations with India. India is seen as an extremely important partner for Japan. Let's remember that 10 years ago, actually 13 years ago in 2007, it was Prime Minister Abe during his first term in office who talked about this new Indo-Pacific strategy, which was intended to bring in India to make sure that India would play a more prominent role. So India is very important to Japan, and we can certainly expect Suga to continue to try to reinforce ties. And Suga is not only going to be the only one. We know that the United States wants to reinforce ties with India as well. In Australia, same thing for Australia. So India is certainly an important, I would say, bulwark in terms of pushing back on some of the more assertive Chinese behavior.
Right. You mentioned the United States there, and US has been one of the driving forces behind Quad in recent times. Secretary Pompeo has been very vocal about strengthening this Quad partnership. Some are calling this the Asian NATO. Is it fair to call it that?
At the moment, it is not. It's not an exactly accurate description. The reason for that is it's still at the moment an informal strategic forum. Certainly, there have been calls to make this a more formal gathering. As a matter of fact, over the last, I think it was about a month ago, the US Secretary of State, Stephen Biegun, talked about the possibility of making this a formal arrangement. And if it ever becomes a formal security arrangement, then we could certainly draw comparisons with NATO. The only kind of comparison, a fair comparison, I would say, with NATO is the fact that NATO itself, of course, was established in 1949 as a way to counter the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And the comparison we could say is, of course, the Quad largely is as a response to China, although they kind of want to play down the fact that China is the driving force behind the meeting, of course. So that's the kind of comparison we can draw between the two, but the level of formality is obviously very different. However, I would imagine that even though there may be pushes to formalize Quad into some kind of formal institution, there is going to be some pushback on the part of several countries, including India, for that matter. So I think for the time being, it's likely to continue to be somewhat of a informal arrangement. But that doesn't mean that it is not a significant and important meeting.
Absolutely. You know, this meeting is happening in person and not virtually, so that itself signifies how much importance these four nations are putting on this Quad partnership. But one final very quick question: what major announcements can we expect, or any major decision that can be expected out of this Quad meeting?
Great question. I'm not sure if we can expect, as a matter of fact, some kind of groundbreaking announcement or important new direction. This meeting, in more than anything, is meant to really reinforce or send a kind of message to Beijing at a very critical juncture. We may perhaps hear some kind of further coordination on the response to COVID-19. But beyond that, I think this really serves to be, as I mentioned, a kind of symbolic gesture, reinforce ties, especially in person, as you mentioned. So that remains a very important meeting.
Right, Professor. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Benoit Hari Chartrand, and we'll keep an eye out for any development coming out of Tokyo.